The heat that August afternoon was the kind that didn't just sit on your skin. It pressed down on your chest like a hand trying to hold you in place, like the desert itself had decided that today, nobody was going anywhere without its permission. Black Ridge, Arizona had that effect on people, even on a good day. This was not a good day. Riley Hart had been awake since 4 in the morning. She'd worked the breakfast rush alone because Donna had called in sick for the third time this month, and nobody was coming to cover. She'd mopped the floor twice, refilled the sugar dispensers, wiped down the counter until the laminate showed its age in long pale streaks, and smiled at every single customer the way her grandmother had taught her. Wide enough to mean it. Not so wide it looked like desperation wearing a friendly face. She was good at that, smiling through things. She'd had 6 months of practice. The Route 66 diner wasn't much to look at from the outside, and it wasn't much more from the inside. Cracked vinyl stools in a shade of red that had faded to something closer to rust. A counter that tilted 2 degrees to the left enough that a coffee mug left unattended would drift slowly toward the edge over the course of an hour. A ceiling fan that clicked on every third rotation like a tired old man clearing his throat, reminding anyone within earshot that it was still there, still trying, still turning. But it was hers in the way a place becomes yours when you've spent more hours inside it than anywhere else on earth. She knew every scratch on the counter and what had made each one. She knew which booth wobbled if you leaned too hard to the right, and she knew to warn the couples because they were always the ones who leaned. She knew the coffee in the back pot ran 30 seconds stronger than the pot up front, and she knew which regulars wanted the strong stuff without asking and which ones would complain if they got it by accident. She knew Heck Dolan, her cook, took his first break at 10:15 every morning and spent it standing at the back door not smoking because he'd quit 8 years ago, but still needed the ritual of standing where he used to smoke, looking at the same piece of sky he'd looked at while he was doing it. She knew the sound of his footsteps on the kitchen tile, the specific rhythm of a big man who moved carefully in a small space. She knew his silences as well as his words, maybe better. She had learned in 6 months of grief that sat inside her chest like a stone. She couldn't put down that you could know everything about a place and still feel completely lost inside it. She was refilling the coffee for a trucker named Denny who came in every Tuesday and always ordered the same thing. Black coffee, 2 eggs over easy wheat toast. He never touched when she heard it. Not heard it exactly. Felt it first. A vibration that moved through the soles of her sneakers before it became sound. Through the floor, through the tile, up, through the bones in her feet and her ankles and her legs, until it settled somewhere in the base of her spine as a low, persistent tremor that her body recognized before her mind had caught up. Then it became sound, low and thick and rolling like thunder that hadn't decided yet how serious it was going to get. She set the coffee pot down. Denny was already looking toward the window. The woman in booth 3 had stopped mid-sentence whatever she'd been saying to her husband, simply abandoned in the air between them. The couple by the door had gone still in the way people go still when they hear something their instincts flag before their reasoning can name it. The sound grew. It went from a rumble to a roar, and then it stopped being sound and became something else entirely, a physical presence, a pressure against the glass, a vibration that made the coffee cups on the counter tremble in their saucers like something small and frightened. Riley watched the first Harley come through the window frame of her view like a dark comet, chrome catching the white August sun and throwing it back hard enough to make her squint. The engine note deep and throated and absolute, cutting off every other sound in the world for just 1 second. Then the second bike, then the 10th. She stopped counting somewhere around 20. 40 motorcycles, maybe more, moving in formation with the coordinated ease of people who had done this 10,000 times, who had arrived in places like this their entire adult lives and watched the same thing happen every single time, the way a room reorganized itself around their presence without a single word being spoken. Death's Head patches, Iron Cross MC, the top rocker reading Iron Cross in letters she could read from 30 feet away. The bottom rocker, Arizona. Denny pushed back his stool so fast it caught the edge of the counter and sent his coffee mug off the edge. It hit the tile floor and shattered into 4 clean pieces. He looked at it for exactly 1 second. Then he looked at the window. Then he stood up and pressed himself back against the far wall, like a man hoping the wall might open up and let him through. Nobody reacted to the broken mug. Nobody looked at it. Riley heard Heck's footsteps stop in the kitchen. A long pause. Then his voice came through the pickup window, low and flat, the voice he used when he was keeping everything very controlled because the alternative was losing it completely. "Riley, get to the back door, now." She didn't move. "I hear you, Heck," she said. She was watching the parking lot. They moved with the kind of order that told you this wasn't chaos. This was a machine that knew exactly what it was doing and had never once in its operational history been surprised by the reaction it produced in the rooms it entered. They parked in a formation that wasn't random bikes angled in a specific pattern, riders dismounting with the unhurried movements of people who had no reason to rush because nothing in the environment constituted a threat. The engines cut out almost simultaneously. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. Inside the diner, nobody breathed. The woman in booth 3 had her hand over her mouth. Her husband had his arm across the back of the booth between them, not touching her, just positioned there, the instinct of a man putting himself between his family and a door. The couple near the entrance had simply ceased to be inside the diner. She hadn't seen them go, but they were gone, the door to the back hallway, still swinging slightly on its hinges. Denny had become part of the far wall. Riley picked up her order pad. The diner door opened. He came in first. She would learn his name in the next 20 minutes. Garrett Voss, National Enforcer. The man the entire Iron Cross MC chapter answered to when things stopped being routine and started being serious. But in that first moment, walking through the door of her diner with 40 men moving in behind him like a tide, he was simply a wall of presence. 6'3", built the way certain men are built when decades of living in a physical world have compressed muscle and consequence into the same frame. Dark hair going gray at the temples. A face that had been through things most people encountered only in stories other people told, and had come out the other side of those things not destroyed but altered, hardened in certain places, worn smooth in others. His eyes moved across the room slowly. Not nervously, not quickly, slowly, and with complete deliberateness, the way a man's eyes move when he is absolutely certain that nothing in the room is a threat to him, and he is simply taking inventory at his own pace. Those eyes landed on Riley. She didn't look away. Something shifted in his expression. So small you could have missed it if you weren't watching his face the way she'd been trained to watch faces. 4 years of reading customers, of knowing from across a room whether someone needed more coffee or the check, or just a minute of being left alone. The fractional hesitation of a man who had walked into 10,000 rooms and had developed an unconscious certainty about what he would find in each of them, and had just found something that didn't match the expectation. He walked to the counter and sat down. The men behind him filed in, filling every stool, every booth, standing along the back wall in a row 2 deep. The diner that felt perfectly adequate on a normal Tuesday afternoon suddenly had no room in it at all. The air changed texture. The space between the counter and the wall behind her, which she could normally navigate without thinking, suddenly felt measured and specific. Heck had gone completely silent in the kitchen. She couldn't hear his breathing anymore. She couldn't hear anything from back there. Riley stood directly in front of Garrett Voss. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Coffee," she said. He held her gaze for a long moment. His expression didn't change. Then he said, "Yeah." She poured it. Her hand didn't shake. She registered this in some calm back corner of her mind. Filed it away, noted it was quietly proud of it, in the way you can be proud of something, while simultaneously not having time to feel the pride, and set the mug in front of him and turned to take the orders of the men on the nearest stools. Same tone, same efficient rhythm, the same practiced movement down the line that she used every Tuesday when the church crowd came in after the late service and needed coffee and pie in a hurry. Behind her, she heard one of the bikers say something low to the man beside him. Not quite for her ears, but not for them either. Something with a quality to it, the tone of a comment about someone who is right there and can hear you delivered just quietly enough to maintain deniability. She caught the word nerve. She caught something that might have been girl. She didn't respond to it. She moved down the line and wrote down what people ordered and called it back to Heck through the pickup window, and Heck, God bless him, started cooking without a word. The griddle heated, the coffee brewed, the diner operated in an approximation of its normal self, and for 20 minutes, that approximation held. She was refilling Garrett's cup for the second time. She knew when someone's mug was approaching. Empty the way she knew when her own lungs were approaching empty, from a kind of a tension that had become involuntary over years when it happened. The man 2 stools down from Garrett, broad through the shoulders, gray beard trimmed close forearms, covered in ink from wrist to elbow. He'd been watching her since they came in, not in a threatening way, just in the way of a man assessing something he wasn't sure how to categorize. He'd eaten his food without comment, paid attention to the room rather than his plate. He leaned forward slightly and said to Garrett, volume just above a murmur, but carrying in the silence that had established itself inside these walls. "This is the place. This is where the kid used to work." The words dropped into the room like something thrown into still water. Everything that had been almost normal ceased to be almost normal. Riley set the coffee pot down on the counter. She set it down slowly and with care, the way you set something down when you need your hands to be empty and your body to be still. She turned around. Where, she said, who used to work where? The gray-bearded man looked at her. Something moved across his face. Surprise first, then a quick recalculation, then something she couldn't fully name that sat between wariness and a kind of respect that hadn't been earned yet but was being considered. He glanced at Garrett. Garrett hadn't moved. He was watching her. His coffee mug was in his hand, and he was watching her with the same slow deliberateness he'd used to scan the room when he walked in. But this was different from that. This had something in it she hadn't seen in that first look. Something that was trying to figure out a specific thing about her rather than just cataloging the room. "Carson Hart," Riley said. "Not a question. A statement." She watched the gray-bearded man's face confirm it before he said a word, in the slight tightening around his eyes and the way his chin moved back half an inch. "You're talking about my brother," she said. The counter went very quiet. She had their attention now, all of it. The full, concentrated weight of 40 sets of eyes converging on one 23-year-old woman in a diner apron, with 6 months of grief pressed flat beneath her sternum, like a stone she had been carrying so long she'd stopped noticing its weight, until this moment when everything in the room was still and there was no motion to carry her forward, and she had to hold it herself. She held it. "You knew him," she said. Not a question. Her voice was steady in the way a river is steady, not because it isn't moving, but because it has been moving in one direction for long enough that it knows exactly where it's going. Garrett said nothing. "He's been gone 6 months," she said. "Nobody in this town will tell me anything. The police say there's no evidence of a crime. I've left 4 messages with the FBI office in Phoenix, and I have never once received a call back. I've filed 4 missing persons reports, and each one disappeared into the same silence as the last." She paused one beat too. "And now you are sitting in his diner." The gray-bearded man's jaw tightened slightly. "It's not his diner," he said. "No," Riley agreed. "It's mine. But he worked here and you knew him. And I am asking you directly right now to your face, what happened to my brother?" Garrett set his coffee mug down. He looked at her for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was low and unhurried. The voice of a man who selected his words the way a surgeon selects instruments, deliberately, specifically, with a clear sense of what each one was meant to accomplish. "You shouldn't be asking that question," he said. "I've been told that before," Riley said. "It hasn't stopped me yet." Something moved in his eyes. Not warmth exactly. More like the expression of a man who has been playing a particular game for a very long time and has just discovered that the person across from him has been playing a different game than the one he assumed, and the discovery is not entirely unwelcome. "Your brother," he said, "made some choices. Those choices put him in contact with some dangerous people." "I know," Riley said. Then you understand why there are things I can't. I found the recordings. The sentence landed differently than anything else she'd said. She felt the change in the room before she could see it, a shift in the quality of the silence, a change in the air pressure, something that moved from person to person without sound. She watched it happen. The gray-bearded man straightened almost imperceptibly. Two of the men along the back wall exchanged a look. A man near the window turned his head toward Garrett by a quarter inch. Garrett did not move, but his eyes, those slow, deliberate eyes, sharpened, changed. The quality of his attention shifted in a way that changed his entire face. "What recordings?" he said. Flat, not a question. "The ones Carson hid before he disappeared," Riley said. "I found them 2 weeks ago. I've been listening to them ever since." She held his gaze. The room held its breath. "Here's what I know," she said. "He didn't betray you. He was set up. And whoever set him up is still operating inside your organization." Absolute silence. "He died protecting one of your men," she said. "I know this because I heard him say it on tape in his own voice alone in a room." She had rehearsed this sentence. She had said it in her car on the way to work. She had said it to her bathroom mirror at 2 in the morning, standing in her socks on the cold tile floor. She had built toward it for 6 months without fully knowing it, and had refined it in the last 2 weeks since she'd found the recorder sitting alone in Carson's room with his old jacket over her shoulders and his voice coming out of a small gray device in her hand. She looked directly at Garrett Voss. "I know you didn't kill my brother," she said, "because he died protecting one of you." The silence that followed was the deepest she had ever heard. She held it. She did not look away. She did not shift her weight or touch her hair or do any of the small involuntary things a body does when it wants to break a silence it has created. Her job in this moment was to stay exactly where she was standing behind this counterchin. Level, eyes steady, and let the words sit in the air and do the work she had built them to do. Garrett stared at her. 10 seconds passed. She counted them. Then he said very quietly, "Where are these recordings now?" "Somewhere safe," she said. "Not here. You came here alone." "Yes, knowing we'd be here." "I heard the engine," she said. "I didn't run." She paused. "I'm done running." For a long moment, the only sound was the ceiling fan clicking on its cycle click, turn, click, and the distant sound of the highway through the walls, and the dense quiet of a room full of people who are all thinking the same thing and not saying it. Then Garrett looked over his shoulder at the gray-bearded man. The look held a full conversation inside it, questions and answers and decisions compressed into 4 seconds of eye contact between two people who had been reading each other for long enough that they no longer needed words for certain things. He turned back to Riley. "Sit down," he said. "I'll stand," she said. He almost smiled. Not quite. The corner of his mouth moved by a fraction, but almost. "All right," he said. "Then stand." He picked up his coffee, took a slow drink, set it down. His hands were very still on the counter. His face had settled into something she couldn't fully categorize. Not the expression of a man who had been caught off guard. Not the expression of a man who was pretending he hadn't been. Something between those two things. The expression of a man who has decided to stop pretending. "Your brother," he began, and the world changed. She had known in the abstract way you can know something that lives in the back of your mind, like a shadow that moves when the light changes, that whatever Carson had been involved in was larger than anything she could see from where she stood. She'd understood this from the recordings, from the way his voice dropped when he approached certain subjects like a man lowering his head before walking through a door he wasn't sure was safe. From the specific silences between his sentences, which told her more than the words did. But knowing something from a distance and standing inside it are two entirely different things. Garrett spoke slowly and without softening anything, the way a man speaks when he has decided to tell the truth and is not going to dress it up in anything easier. He told her that Carson hadn't arrived in their world by accident. He'd been brought in deliberately, specifically as part of an operation that Garrett didn't name directly, but described with enough specificity that she understood it, her brother had been transporting evidence. Evidence against people in positions of federal authority who had decided that the power they'd been given was a personal resource rather than a public responsibility. He told her the club had believed Carson ran, had turned, had taken what he'd been trusted with and disappeared into whatever life a man builds for himself after he burns every bridge he was standing on. You thought he was a traitor, Riley said. Yes, Garrett said. No hesitation, no softening of the word. And you were wrong. A pause. Longer than the ones before it. It's looking that way, he said. She absorbed that. She turned it over. She gave it exactly the space it needed and not 1 second more. So whoever sold him out is still with you, she said. If what you're saying is accurate, yes. He looked at her steadily. You're very certain for someone working from voice recordings. I'm certain, Riley said, because Carson named him. Not directly, but he described him in enough detail that when you hear it, you'll know. She met his eyes. And you'll know that I'm right. Garrett was quiet. Around them, the diner had gone so still it felt sealed, as if the outside world had been paused, suspended, set aside, as if nothing existed beyond these walls except this conversation and the weight of everything it was moving through. Why are you doing this? Garrett said finally. His voice had changed, not softer, more direct. The quality a voice gets when it stops performing and starts asking. When the man behind it decides that the performance isn't getting him what he needs, and the actual question is the only thing left to try. She looked at him for a moment. Because Carson is alive, she said. She watched that land. I don't know where, she said. I don't know what condition he's in, but I know he isn't dead, and you have resources I don't have. You have reach that no journalist has, that no honest cop in this state has. She paused. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing this for him. He gave something to your people. Now I need something back. Garrett looked at her with an expression she would spend a long time afterward trying to find the right word for. Bewilderment was part of it, the genuine and unguarded bewilderment of a man who had spent decades being feared and had not recently encountered an exception. But there was something else in it too, something older and quieter that she didn't try to name. You're not afraid of us, he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation, the tone of a man reporting something he has verified against his own expectation and found to be against all probability true. I'm terrified, Riley said honestly, but she held his eyes when she said it. I'm more terrified of the alternative, she said, of going another 6 months without knowing, of filing another report that disappears, of being the sister who was careful and quiet and well-behaved and lost him anyway. Her jaw tightened. I'd rather be afraid and moving than safe and still. From somewhere along the back wall, the gray-bearded man let out a breath that was almost a laugh. It had no mockery in it. If anything, it had the quality she recognized from Heck Dolan on his best days, the sound a person makes when they've seen something they weren't expecting, and the surprise has tipped over into something close to admiration. Garrett looked at his coffee. He looked at the counter. Then he looked back up at her. We're going to need to hear those recordings, he said. I know, she said. Tonight, tell me where. She felt something in the room shift again, not the sharp shift of the moment she'd named Carson, not the electric shift when she'd mentioned the recordings. Something slower, something that moved through the space the way the heat of the day moves through a building, gradually, completely, until it has changed the temperature of everything inside. You're going to trust a room full of Iron Cross with the only evidence you have, Garrett said. That's not a small thing. No, she agreed. It's not. Why? She looked at him for a long moment. Because Carson trusted you, she said. And he was right to. Somebody else let him down, but not you. Not your people. She held his eyes. And because I have nowhere else left to go. The words sat between them. Garrett looked at her with that evaluating expression she had now seen cross his face 3 times in this conversation, each time she said something that didn't land where he expected it to. Each time the recalibration had taken slightly longer, as if the gap between his expectation and the reality of the person in front of him kept widening, and he kept having to step further to close it. Then he said, "You've got guts, I'll give you that." "I've got a brother," Riley said. "That's not the same thing, but it gets you to the same place." From the kitchen, she heard the griddle click off, Heck cutting the heat. Not because service was over, because Heck Dolan paid attention to everything that happened in and around his kitchen, and he understood without being told that whatever was happening on the other side of his pickup window was not going to end with a normal dinner rush. Outside, the late afternoon light was beginning to flatten against the desert. The heat was shifting, not cooling, but changing quality the way Arizona heat does in the hour before dusk, when the sky begins running through colors that don't exist with names in other climates. Red into gold into something almost purple along the horizon that always looked to Riley like a bruise the day was proud of. She picked up her coffee pot. She walked back to the counter. She topped off Garrett's mug. "You want anything to eat?" she said. He blinked. And then something happened on Garrett Voss's face that she suspected did not happen very often and probably surprised even him when it did. He laughed. Not loud, not performed. Brief and low and real. "Yeah," he said. "Burger, whatever you've got." She wrote it down. She turned to the window. "Heck," she called. "One burger." A long pause from the kitchen. Longer than the time it took to hear a burger order and acknowledge it. Then his voice came back, tight but steady. "Coming right up." She stood behind the counter of her diner, surrounded by 40 of the most feared men in the American Southwest, and she did what she had been doing all day. She worked, because her brother was alive somewhere out there in the dark, and she had just started the clock on bringing him home. And between now and then, the only thing she knew how to do was keep her hands moving and the engine running. The burger was half eaten when Garrett pushed the plate aside and looked at her again. "Walk me through it," he said. "The recordings. Everything you heard." She had been waiting for this. She had rehearsed it the same way she'd rehearsed the sentence about Carson dying to protect one of them. Not the way you rehearse a lie, but the way you rehearse something true that you need to say exactly right, because one wrong word in the wrong place could collapse the whole structure of it. She pulled a stool from under the counter and sat down across from him, the counter between them, and she told him everything. She told him that 6 weeks after Carson disappeared, she'd gone through his room for what she'd thought was the last time. Not because she'd given up. She was not built for giving up. This was something she had discovered about herself in the most direct way possible, but because she'd already gone through it so many times that she'd stopped believing anything new was going to surface. Grief does that. It makes you repeat certain motions because stopping them feels like a kind of surrender, but it also eventually exhausts the spaces where repetition can live. She pulled Carson's old work boots out from the back of his closet. The left one felt wrong, heavier than it should be, unbalanced in a way that didn't make sense until she reached inside. A small digital recorder, wrapped in black electrical tape, the kind you could buy at any hardware store for $20. 11 recordings. The first 3 were short. Logistics, dates, and locations. The dry, careful language of someone creating a document for the record, someone who understood that they might be creating evidence and was being precise about it. But the 4th recording was different. Carson's voice changed starting with the 4th one. The acoustics told her he was alone. A small room, soft surfaces, the flatness of a space with no echo. And he was scared. Not panicking. Carson didn't panic easily. This was something she had known about him his entire life. From the time he was 11 years old and their mother's car went off the road in the rain, and he was the one who stayed calm and called for help, while Riley sat frozen in the back seat, but scared in the controlled, deliberate way of someone who has looked at the road ahead and understood clearly that it doesn't go anywhere good. He said, and she gave them his exact words, because his exact words were the only thing she had of him that was still perfectly intact. He said, "If something happens to me, it wasn't them. It was someone inside. Someone with a patch and a handshake and a face I trusted." The gray-bearded man, she had learned now that his name was Rudy Falk, that he was Garrett's second, that he had been with the Iron Cross MC for longer than she had been alive, set his coffee mug down very slowly. Set it down with the care of a man making sure his hands had something controlled to do. He said that, Garrett said. Those words. Yes. Then what? Then he described his meeting. 3 weeks before he vanished, a man came to him alone. Didn't go through the club, offered him a way out, said the federal heat was coming, said the operation was burned, said the smart move was to take what they'd gathered and hand it to a specific federal contact who could make everything go away cleanly. He said this man told Carson it had already been cleared with club leadership. Garrett's jaw tightened. It hadn't, Riley said, because Carson called someone higher up that same night to confirm, and that person had no idea what he was talking about, which meant the man who'd come to him was running his own play. And when Carson figured that out, and when the man realized Carson had figured it out, that's when everything went wrong, Garrett said. Yes. Rudy leaned forward slightly. Who did Carson say he called to confirm? He doesn't say the name on the recording. He calls him the old man. I don't know who that is. Garrett and Rudy exchanged a look. Something passed between them in that exchange that she couldn't fully decode, but could feel the weight of a specific meaning that landed between two people who shared enough history to communicate in shorthand. Whatever she'd said had answered a question that had apparently been hanging open for some time. The federal contact, Garrett said, the one the man brought to Carson. Did he give a name? Frank Calloway. The reaction was immediate and physical. Two men near the window straightened. Someone at the back wall made a sound that wasn't a word. Rudy turned away from her and looked at the wall for a moment, the gesture of a man who needs somewhere to put his eyes while he processes something he wasn't ready to receive. Garrett didn't move, but the stillness that came over him was a different kind than the composed deliberateness he'd carried all evening. This was the stillness of a man whose internal systems were running at full speed while his exterior had locked down completely. The stillness of absolute zero. You know that name, Riley said. Yeah, Garrett said quietly. We know that name. Tell me. He looked at her for a moment, then he told her. Frank Calloway had been running an operation out of the Nevada field office for 3 years. Officially, it was a joint task force. Officially, it was about targeting trafficking networks. Officially, it existed to make things safer for people in the region. Unofficially, Calloway had stopped caring about making things safer for anyone other than Frank Calloway a long time ago. He was running money, skimming from operations using the task force structure as cover in engineering situations where clubs and independent operators took the fall when anything threatened to surface. He controlled which informants got burned. He controlled which evidence went missing. He had been doing it long enough that the network he'd built around himself was dense and layered and very difficult to approach from the outside. He's been doing this for 3 years and nobody's been able to touch him, Riley said. Because every time someone gets close, Garrett said that someone stops being able to get close. He meets with an accident, or they discredit themselves, or they simply, he paused. They simply stop being findable. Like Carson Riley said, it wasn't a question. Garrett didn't answer, which was its own answer. She put her hands flat on the counter. She needed the solidity of the surface under her palms. The recordings proved it, she said. They prove Carson was feeding you legitimate intelligence. They prove he was set up by someone inside your organization who then handed him to Calloway. If we go public... You can't go public, Garrett said. Sharp for the first time all evening. The first sharp thing he'd said. She looked at him. Why not? Because Calloway has people in every newsroom that matters in this state, Garrett said. The moment those recordings surface publicly, they become evidence in a federal investigation that Calloway controls. He'll have them sealed. He'll bury the chain of custody, and whoever handed them over becomes a witness in a case that will never go to trial. He leaned forward slightly. And then you become a problem he needs to solve. She held his eyes without flinching. So what do? We find the recordings first, all copies. We verify them internally, and then we figure out who inside this organization handed your brother to that man. You already have a suspect, Riley said. She watched his face. You've been thinking about someone this whole conversation. I can see it. Rudy made a sound, not quite a laugh, Not quite a warning. Something in between. Garrett looked at her for a long moment. "You're perceptive," he said. "I've been working tables since I was 17, she said. "You learned to read people." He was quiet. Then slowly he said, "There's a man, a captain, been with us for 14 years. His name is Dean Briggs. We call him Razor." The name dropped into the conversation, and something changed in the atmosphere of the room. Several of the men along the back wall went very quiet in a way that was different from the quiet. Before this was the quiet of people who have just heard something said aloud that has previously existed only as a thought. The silence of a thing becoming real. "He trained Carson," Riley said slowly. The recordings came back to her. Carson's voice warm in a way she hadn't heard it often enough, talking about the man who'd shown him how things worked, who'd sat across from him at dinner, who'd vouched for him. "He trained my brother," she said again. "Yes," Garrett said. "And you think he's the one. I've thought it for 2 months." He looked at the counter. "I don't have proof. Just a feeling and a few things that don't add up." He paused. "Does the voice match anyone you've heard before?" "I've never met any of you before tonight," Riley said. "But describe something specific. A phrase. Something unusual about the way this man speaks." She closed her eyes. She had listened to those recordings enough times that she could play them back in her head with near-perfect fidelity. She could hear the quality of the silence in the room where Carson had been sitting. She could hear the specific cadence of his breathing between sentences. She opened her eyes. "He said the man who came to Carson, he said, 'This is the cleanest exit you're going to get, brother. The highway's closing.' That was how he put it. The highway's closing." The silence that followed was different from every silence before it in this room tonight. Different because it wasn't empty. It was full, dense with something that had been formless and was now taking on the weight of a confirmed thing. Rudy had turned back toward her. His face had gone a color she didn't like. Garrett's hand resting flat on the counter had curled slowly into a fist. She watched it happen. She didn't think he was aware of it. "That's a phrase," she said carefully. "That's something specific to him." "Razor has used that phrase for years," Garrett said very quietly. He looked up at her. "It's his. Nobody else uses it." He met her eyes. "You just confirmed something I have been trying to confirm for 60 days. She felt something move through her. Not triumph, there was nothing in this that felt like winning. More like the nauseating lurch of something enormous, beginning to move something that has been balanced on a ledge for a long time and has just tipped past the point of return. "He's going to know," she said. "When word gets back that I came here, that I talked to you, he'll understand what it means." "Yes," Garrett said. "How long before?" "Not long." He looked at Rudy. Something passed between them, quick and decisive, the compressed communication of a decision made. Then Garrett looked back at her. "Where are the recordings?" "My apartment. Hidden." "You need to not be at your apartment tonight." "I understand that. Is there anyone in this town who knew you were planning to approach us today? Anyone at all?" She thought about it honestly, carefully, the way she always thought about things when the stakes were high enough that wishful thinking was a liability. "No," she said. "I didn't tell anyone. I barely admitted it to myself until this morning." He nodded. "That buys us a few hours." He stood, all 6'3" of him rising in a single motion, and he looked down at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him yet tonight. The look of a man who has been surprised genuinely repeatedly beyond his capacity to remain unsurprised and has arrived somewhere new on the other side of it. Not warmer exactly, but different. "You're going to come with us tonight," he said. "You're going to retrieve those recordings, and then we're going to listen to all of them together, every word." And then Riley said, "And then he said, we're going to find out where Frank Calloway is keeping your brother." She stood. She untied her apron. She folded it with a care that was its own kind of statement, the careful folding of someone performing a small, deliberate gesture as a stand-in for a much larger one. Setting something down. Acknowledging that whatever version of normal life had existed before this afternoon was being placed here on this counter and she didn't know when she'd come back to pick it up. Heck appeared at the pickup window. He looked at her. He looked at Garrett. He looked back at her. His face held the expression of a man who has a great many things he wants to say and has identified with some effort that now is not the time to say any of them. Lock up when you're done. Heck, she said. He stopped himself from saying her name, cleared his throat instead. I'll call you tomorrow, she said. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. She looked at him. Good, reliable, careful Heck Dolan, who had worked beside her for 4 years and never once let her down in any way that mattered. She let him see in her face that she wasn't being reckless, that she'd thought about this, that she was doing it anyway with full knowledge of what it was. I know exactly what I'm doing, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his expression, the slow movement of a man arriving at an acceptance he hadn't chosen, but was going to carry with the same reliability he brought to everything else. You call me, he said, the second you can. First thing she said. They left together. She walked out into the Arizona evening surrounded by 40 Iron Cross MC riders, and the sky above the flat desert horizon was doing the thing it did at this hour. The thing that always made her think whoever was responsible for Arizona sunsets had been given too much to work with and had decided to use all of it at once. Red and gold and the deep orange that only exists in the last 20 minutes before dark. The heat was finally reluctantly beginning to let go. Behind her, she heard one of the younger riders, barely older than her, maybe 25, say quietly to the man beside him, "Who is this girl?" And she heard the other man say just as quietly, "Carson Hart's sister." A pause. "She coming with us." Apparently she doesn't do afraid. A longer pause. I don't think afraid is a thing she does. She didn't react to it. She kept walking toward the parking lot, toward the waiting van, toward whatever the night had decided it was going to hold. But she felt it, the shift, the small but unmistakable adjustment of presence around her, the way 40 men who had spent their entire adult lives being the most dangerous thing in any room they walked into were now in some small but completely real way rearranging themselves around her. Not to protect her, not to manage her. Something else. Something that didn't have a simple name. Something that felt, if she was being honest with herself in the way this night was demanding honesty from her, like the beginning of being taken seriously. She had been waiting for that for 6 months. She got in the van, the door closed behind her, the engine started, and the night began. They retrieved the recordings from her apartment in under 10 minutes. She knew exactly where they were, not because she'd hidden them carelessly, but because she'd hidden them the way Carson had hidden his, in the obvious place that wasn't obvious, the place that required knowing something about the person who lived there to find. Inside the lining of his old leather jacket, the one she kept hanging on the back of her bedroom door because taking it down felt too much like making a decision she wasn't ready to make. She reached into the lining along the left seam. Her fingers found the recorder and the small USB drive she'd made as backup 3 days after she'd found the original, because she was her brother's sister, and her brother had understood that single points of failure were the most dangerous kind. She held them in her palm for a moment before handing them over. Garrett took them. He held the recorder in his large hand and looked at it with an expression she hadn't seen on him yet tonight, something stripped of the deliberateness he'd carried all evening. Something that lived below the level of the composed and operational man who had walked into her diner and ordered coffee. Something older and quieter. He planned for this, Garrett said. Not to her specifically, more to the air between them. He planned for everything Riley said, even as a kid. He used to drive me crazy with it, had a contingency before most people had finished thinking about the first option. Her voice caught slightly on the last sentence. She pulled it back. She was aware of Rudy Falk standing near the door and 2 other men she hadn't been introduced to, and she was aware that catching her voice in Carson's bedroom in front of 40 bikers was not the moment she wanted to come apart. He planned for the possibility that he wouldn't make it out, Garrett said. Yes, he planned for someone to look. Yes, he planned for you. Riley looked at the recorder in Garrett's hand. At the electrical tape, Carson had wrapped it in black tape, careful tight. The tape of a man who expected it to wait a while before being found. Yes, she said, he planned for me. They listened to the recordings in the back of a reinforced van, parked 2 miles outside of Black Ridge, on a dirt pull-off that wasn't marked on any map she'd ever seen. All 11 recordings, beginning to end. Nobody spoke during the playback. Garrett sat with his forearms on his knees and his eyes on the floor. Rudy sat with his back against the van wall and his arms crossed, and his face doing things she couldn't fully read in the low light. She watched their faces anyway. She had nothing else to do with her hands and her attention, and watching faces was the thing she was best at. What she saw was not what she'd expected. She'd expected calculation, the hard operational assessment of men processing tactical information, the focused expression of people taking inventory of what they learned and what it meant for what came next. That was there. But underneath it, and this was the thing she hadn't anticipated, the thing that surprised her and then on reflection didn't. Underneath it was something older, something closer to grief. These men had known Carson Hart, had trusted him, had eaten at tables with him and called him brother and considered him, in whatever way that word meant inside their world, one of their own. And now they were listening to his voice coming out of a small gray device. Recorded alone in a room months ago, scared but steady, documenting a betrayal with the methodical calm of someone who understood that the record might outlast him. When the 11th recording ended, nobody spoke for 30 seconds. The silence had weight. Then a man near the front of the van, big quiet, someone who hadn't said a word all evening said, "That's Razor's voice." "Yeah," said another. The first man said it again, louder. Not because the room hadn't heard him the first time, because the statement required more weight the second time through, because some things need to be said twice before they become fully real. "That's Razor's voice." Garrett said nothing. He was looking at the recorder in his hand. His expression was the expression of a man watching something he had half believed become fully irreversibly real, and finding himself now on the far side of that moment in the territory where doubt is no longer available as an option and only action remains. He looked up. He looked at Riley. "Razor left camp this morning," he said. "Said he had business in Nevada." She felt the implications settle through her the way cold water settles, completely finding every space. "He knows," she said. "Maybe not the full picture yet, but he sensed something." He paused. "Razor has a contact inside Calloway's operation. If he's made a call, then Calloway knows about the recordings," Riley said. "Then Calloway knows about you," Garrett said. She turned that over. She examined it from every angle she could find. Every angle led to the same place. "Then we don't have time," she said. "No," Garrett agreed. "That's why we moved tonight." She looked around the van, at the faces in the low light. Men at various stages of the same expression, the look of people who have been handed something true and have already moved past the question of whether they believe it and arrived at the question of what happens next. "What do you need from me?" she said. Garrett looked at her. "You know these recordings better than anyone here," he said. "You've heard details in them we haven't had time to process yet. Locations, dates, things that might mean nothing on their own, but mean something when we're looking at the right map." "Okay, I need you thinking all night," he said. "Whatever Carson said that you haven't told us yet, I need all of it." "Okay." He held her eyes for a moment longer. "And I need you to understand something." His voice dropped, not softer, just more direct, the quality of a voice that has stopped editing itself. "Where we're going tonight, there's no legal framework that applies. When we find Razor—" He stopped, corrected himself. "When we find your brother," he said, "none of what happens next is going to be something you can unknow afterward." She met his eyes without flinching. "I know," she said. "You're still in." "My brother is in a hole somewhere in the Nevada desert," Riley said. "I'm not going home to wait." Garrett looked at her one more time. That evaluating look, the look of a man who had now had occasion to recalibrate his expectations of her 4 separate times in one evening, and was arriving at the conclusion that he should simply stop expecting her to behave the way he expected her to behave. Then he turned toward the front of the van. "All right," he said, "let's go get him." The engine started, Then another engine outside and another until the whole Arizona night was nothing but sound and forward motion. 40 motorcycles in one van and one 23-year-old woman moving west toward the dark, toward whatever was buried out there under the Nevada sky, toward Carson. They were 40 miles outside of Black Ridge when the first SUV appeared. Riley was in the back of the van with Rudy and two men she hadn't been introduced to, a lean, watchful man named Cutter, who spoke rarely and listened constantly, and a younger man called Brooks, who had the stillness of someone trained to manage his reactions in high-pressure situations. She'd been running the recordings through her head again, extracting details, trying to pull out anything she'd registered but not yet fully processed. A road number Carson had mentioned once in passing. A reference to a water tower visible from a specific vantage point. Something about distance from a state line. She almost missed it when Rudy's phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. His face changed, not dramatically, not the way of a man who is surprised, but the way of a man who has been half expecting something and is now receiving confirmation. "We've got a tail," he said. Flat. Operational. The tone of a man reporting a fact, not a development. The driver, a compact man named Slade, who had said approximately 6 words since Riley had gotten in the van and appeared to regard conversation as an inefficiency, adjusted his mirror without turning his head. "How many?" he said. "1 confirmed. Probably more. Federal plates, running clean." 2 more parallel on the northern service road, came Garrett's voice through the radio on Rudy's belt, immediate and clipped. "They've been pacing us for 6 minutes, Coordinated, Slade said quietly. "That's not surveillance," Rudy said. He looked at Riley. "You told nobody tonight." "Certain. Certain," she said. Then Razor already called it in. He picked up the radio. "Garrett." "I see it." Garrett's voice came back. "Change of plan. We don't go to the bunker tonight. We go to ground first. The diner. 1 road and solid walls, and we know the layout. Riley said I have keys. Then we go back," Garrett said through the radio. "Slade, turn us around." The van turned hard. She grabbed the door handle and held on. Behind them, the SUVs accelerated, no longer maintaining the careful distance of vehicles that want to maintain deniability. They were moving now with the purpose of vehicles that have stopped pretending to be anything other than what they are. They made it back to Black Ridge in 11 minutes. She had the keys out before the van stopped moving. She was through the diner door. In the next breath, Garrett right behind her, the rest of the men flowing in around and past her like water finding available space. She heard the deadbolts engage. She heard the crash of a booth being overturned to reinforce the front door, the specific sound of laminate and vinyl hitting tile that she would have recognized anywhere in any context, because it was the sound of her diner being used for something it had never been designed for. Garrett's voice cut through the noise, controlled and fast and absolutely certain of itself, a different voice than the one that had sat at her counter in order to burger harder and more compressed, the voice of a man in his element. 2 men on the front window. Cutter, take the hallway. Brooks, the east wall. "How many are we looking at?" someone called. "Minimum 12 vehicles from what I counted before the turn," said a voice from near the front. "Could be 20 men. Could be more." "They're not in uniform," Garrett said. "No lights, no badges. These aren't federal agents on a sanctioned operation." He paused. "Callaway keeps a team of private contractors he's been running off a black budget account for 2 years. Men who do the things that can't be done on paper." He looked at Riley. "Stay away from the windows." "I know this building," she said. "Then stay low and stay useful." The first shot came through the front window 40 seconds later. Not a warning shot, not a signal. A direct, deliberate shot that punched through the glass and buried itself in the back wall 6 inches above Heck's pickup window. The glass came down in a cascade. Nobody screamed. 40 men responded with the synchronized efficiency of people who have trained for exactly this moment, voices calling positions, bodies moving to assigned spaces. The controlled noise of a group of people who are afraid and are not allowing the fear to outrun the response. Riley pressed herself against the inside wall beside the kitchen door. She was breathing. She was thinking. Her hands were steady, This is real, she thought. This is actually happening. And then she stopped thinking about whether it was happening and started thinking about what was useful. The shots that followed were not sustained. They were controlled and targeted, the kind of shooting designed to keep people's heads down rather than eliminate them. Which told her something specific. They weren't trying to kill everyone inside. They were trying to create pressure, to generate enough chaos that someone would push civilians out, or someone would try to run, or the situation would become unstable enough to justify a different kind of intervention. They want me outside, she said to Garrett, who had appeared beside her back against the same wall. Yes, he said. Standard pressure play. Create a hostage scenario, force a separation, extract the target in the confusion. He glanced at her sideways. You're not a civilian anymore, by the way. You understand that. I understand that, she said. Whatever you knew about your life before tonight. Garrett, she said. He stopped. I don't need the speech. Tell me what I can do right now. A beat of silence. 2. Then something shifted in his expression, not the recalibration she'd seen before, but something closer to the expression of a man who has stopped being surprised and has arrived at acceptance. The USB drive, he said. Do you still have it? She reached into her pocket, pulled it out, held it up. That drive needs to survive tonight, Garrett said. Those recordings are the only documented proof of what Calloway has been running. Without them, everything dies with us. He held her eyes. You understand what I'm telling you. I understand, she said. Good. She thought for 3 seconds. Then she said there's a crawl space. Under the east side of the building behind the dishwasher unit. It connects to a drainage culvert that runs parallel to the main road. It comes out behind the gas station 200 yards north. It's not comfortable, but it accommodates a person who doesn't mind moving on their elbows. Garrett looked at her. You're suggesting an exit route. I'm suggesting an exit route for the drive, she said. And for one person small enough to move through it fast while Calloway's contractors are focused on the front. Someone who could be clear of this building in the next 5 minutes and carrying the recordings far enough away that even if everything here goes wrong tonight, the evidence doesn't. Garrett was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then he turned and said one word, Slade, and the compact, quiet driver detached from the back wall and crossed the room in 8 steps. Riley handed over the USB drive. She walked him to the crawlspace access point behind the dishwasher, described the route, described the exit, told him what the gas station looked like from the culvert opening and which direction to move once he was clear. He listened with complete focus, nodded once. He was gone. She turned back to Garrett. That's the backup, she said. Now tell me the real plan. He looked at her in the low light, in the fractured noise of the diner under fireglass on the floor, and the ceiling fan still clicking its slow rotation because some things simply continued regardless of everything else. We've been reactive since they appeared behind us, he said. Defending, holding ground, going where they push us, he paused. I don't like playing defense. What are you saying? I'm saying that while his people are focused on this building, they're not focused on their vehicles. And unattended vehicles have a tendency to become problems for the people who need them. He looked past her toward the kitchen. We go out the north side, 6 men. We move around the perimeter while they're still positioning for entry. We disable their transport. We cut their communications. And then 20 contractors who came here to run a siege are 20 contractors standing in the Arizona desert with no ride and no way to call for the next play. She absorbed this. It's aggressive, she said. It works, Rudy said from across the room, because they didn't come here expecting it. They came to lay siege. They didn't come here expecting anyone to walk toward them. He paused. They made the mistake of thinking we'd be afraid. She felt something move through the room when he said it. Something collective and unspoken, a current that ran from person to person without anyone choosing to start it. She felt it in herself, which surprised her. The strange electricity of people who have decided together without a meeting or a vote that they are done being managed by someone else's fear. 30 seconds, Garrett said. North side, Rudy, you're with me. Cut or keep their attention on the front. Make enough noise that they don't notice we've gone quiet in the back. He looked at Riley one final time. Inside, he said, "Down. If anyone comes through any door in the next 10 minutes and it's not one of us, I'll know what to do," Riley said. Something moved in his face. Not a smile, but close. "I believe you," he said. And then they went out the north side into the dark. What happened in the next 12 minutes she pieced together afterward, from what she heard, from what she was told, from the specific sequence of sounds that came through the walls of the diner in an order that told its own story. She heard the distant shout of someone who had been surprised. She heard the sound of something heavy connecting with something metal. She heard a car alarm scream to life and then cut off abruptly mid-cycle. She heard the pattern of gunfire outside change, heard it lose its coordinated quality, heard the controlled aggression of Callaway's contractors dissolve into the disorganized reaction of people who no longer understand where the threat is coming from or how many of them there are. She heard someone give an order outside that was immediately countermanded by someone else. She heard the silence of engines that would not turn over. And then she heard Garrett's voice close just outside the north door. "We've got one. Bring him in." The door opened. They brought in a man she had never seen. Mid-30s tactical clothing, a cut above his left eye from something that had connected with it recently. His hands were secured behind him. He was not in any condition to be uncooperative, but he was attempting it anyway. She respected the attempt without sympathizing with it. Garrett crouched in front of him. "Frank Callaway," Garrett said. "Where is he running this from?" The man said nothing. "I'll ask once more." Silence. Rudy stepped forward from behind Garrett's shoulder. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. He had the kind of face that communicated information without requiring words, and the information it was currently communicating was specific and unambiguous. The contractor looked at Rudy, made a calculation, looked back at Garrett. "I want immunity," he said. His voice was controlled, better controlled than she expected given the circumstances. He was scared she could see it in the way he was managing his breathing, in the slight tension around his jaw, but he was also thinking. Clearly and quickly, the way people think when they have identified that their only remaining asset is information and they need to extract maximum value from it before the window closes. "You want Rudy started." "I want immunity," the man repeated, "in writing before I say a single word about anything." Garrett looked at him for a long moment. "You're not in a position to negotiate," Garrett said. "Neither are you," the man said. "You've got maybe 20 minutes before Callaway sends a second team. Not the one I'm part of. The one with actual federal authorization and warrants that already have your names on them." He paused. "You need what I know more than you need to be right about this conversation." Silence. "Talk first," Garrett said. "Road out after. That's my offer." "That's not—" "It's what I have," Garrett said. "And I keep my word. Ask anyone in this room." The man looked around. He looked at the faces of the men arranged around him. Big, weathered, complicated faces. The faces of men who existed outside the institutional structures this contractor had built his career serving, and who had survived outside those structures for a very long time by operating on a code that was demanding and sometimes brutal, but was above all consistent. She watched him do the math. She watched him arrive at the same place she'd arrived at, standing behind her counter that afternoon holding a coffee pot, looking at Garrett Voss for the first time. Sometimes the most reliable person in the room isn't the one with the badge. "Callaway is at the site," the man said. "Has been for 3 days. He knows you found the recordings." He paused. "He moved the prisoner 2 nights ago, deeper into the facility. There's a substructure below the main bunker floor rooms that don't appear on any official layout." He paused again. "The man you're looking for is in the 3rd room on the left. He was alive 48 hours ago." The room went very still. She heard those words, the way you hear something you've been bracing for so long that when it arrives, your whole system goes quiet trying to receive it. He was alive 48 hours ago. She had not allowed herself in 6 months of searching and filing and waiting and refusing to stop to fully feel the alternative. She had held it at a distance because looking at it directly would have cost her the ability to keep moving. She had held the grief at arm's length and used it as fuel, and told herself she would feel it fully when she had a reason to feel something else. She had a reason now. 48 hours ago. Alive. Garrett stood. He looked across the wrecked interior of the diner at Riley at the overturned booth, the glass on the floor, the ceiling fan still clicking, because yes, some things simply kept going, and she saw in his face what she felt in her chest. Not hope exactly. Something more solid than hope. Certainty beginning to take shape. We move at 0200, he said, before the second team deploys. He looked around the room. Everyone rests, reloads, ready to roll in 90 minutes. Then he looked at Riley. You should eat something, he said. She almost laughed. The almost laugh surprised her, the involuntary response of a person whose body has decided without consulting them that some things are still funny even in the middle of everything. You're telling me to eat something, she said. You haven't eaten since this morning, he said. And where we're going, you're going to need everything you have. She looked at the diner around her, at the damage Calloway's people had made of it, at the glass on the floor, the plywood somebody had already propped against the shattered front window frame, the booth cushion that had come off its base in the barricade. At Heck's pickup window still intact, the little order bell sitting on the ledge exactly where it always sat. She walked behind the counter. She opened the grill. She started cooking. Not because she wasn't afraid, not because any of this was normal, but because Carson was alive somewhere in the Nevada dark, and she was going to get to him, and between now and then she was going to do the only thing she had ever fully trusted herself to do, keep her hands moving and take care of the people in her room. She made food for 40 men in a shot-up diner in the middle of the Arizona night. She moved through the kitchen with the automatic efficiency of a person who had made the same sequence of motions so many times it had become a kind of thinking. Not the thinking that uses words, but the thinking that happens in the hands and the body when the mind needs somewhere useful to put itself. Nobody commented on it. Nobody asked her to. They just ate. They rode out at 2 in the morning. Riley had not slept. She hadn't tried. She'd sat in the corner booth, the one that didn't wobble, the one Carson had always claimed on the days he came in, because he had identified in his methodical way that it had the best sight lines to both the door and the kitchen, with a cup of coffee that went cold and got replaced and went cold again, and she'd gone through everything in her head, every recording, every word, every silence between words, mining for anything she'd heard but not fully processed. Garrett sat across from her about an hour before they moved. He didn't say anything immediately. He sat with his own coffee and the particular silence of a man who has said everything that needed to be said for the moment and is not filling the space for the sake of filling it. For a few minutes, they were just two people in a diner at 1 in the morning. You should tell me what to expect, Riley said. The bunker is a decommissioned military installation, Garrett said. Been off the federal books for 15 years officially. Calloway has been using it for 3. He runs interrogations there. Evidence storage. It's where he processes everything he takes from the operations he burns and the clubs he sets up. He paused. It's not going to be a clean building, Riley. She understood what he meant. She didn't ask him to say it more plainly. How many people has he held there, she said. We don't know exactly. He looked at his coffee. Enough. And Razor, she said, if he's there, he'll be with Calloway. Razor knows we're coming, and he knows there's no move left that doesn't involve putting himself as close to Calloway's protection as possible. He paused. When we find him, let me handle it. Okay. He looked at her steadily. I mean it. I heard you, she said, and she held his gaze without qualification because she did hear him, and she understood what he was telling her, and she had made her peace with it, in the same way she had made her peace with every other piece of this night, not by pretending it was something other than what it was, but by deciding that what it was didn't change what she needed to do. You've been doing this alone for 6 months, he said. Yes. Nobody helped you. People were scared, she said. I don't blame them. This town people here learned a long time ago that making noise about certain things has consequences. They learned it the hard way. She paused. Carson knew it too. He just decided it wasn't a good enough reason to stay quiet. That's why he got into this, Garrett said. Not for money, not for the edge of it. He was quiet for a moment. He told me once, and I don't share things people tell me in confidence as a rule, so understand this is a different circumstance. He said he was tired of watching people with authority use it like a private account. He said someone had to be the friction. She felt something tighten in her throat. That specific phrase, the exact rhythm of it, someone had to be the friction. That was so entirely and completely Carson, his particular way of framing things, the precision of it, the slight impatience underneath the composure, that for a moment he was completely present in the room. Not as a memory, as a person, alive and opinionated and more real than anything else in the diner. She pressed her thumb into her palm under the table and breathed through it. Yeah, she said. That's him. He's a good man, Garrett said. Present tense, deliberate. She noticed it. He is, she said. Same tense, same deliberateness. They moved out at 2. The convoy covered the distance in just under 90 minutes running without headlights for the final stretch. The last 20 miles on roads that didn't appear on any map she'd ever seen, roads that existed because people had driven them enough times that the desert had simply accepted the path the way the desert accepted everything eventually. On its own terms, in its own time. She couldn't see much from inside the van, but she could feel the terrain changing beneath the tires, the surface roughening, the turns getting sharper, the whole character of the journey shifting into something more demanding and less forgiving the way certain things do when you pass the point where turning back is a realistic option. When they stopped, Garrett came to the van door. "Quarter-mile out," he said. "From here we walk." She got out. The air was cold in the way desert air goes cold after midnight, completely efficiently, without any of the gradual cooling of other climates. The sky above them was enormous and clear and full of stars that had no competition out here, no ambient light for 100 miles in any direction. "You stay with Rudy," Garrett said. "You don't move independently. You don't make decisions without clearing them." He looked at her. "This is not negotiable." "Understood," she said. "And Riley." He waited until she was fully looking at him. "Whatever we find in there," he said, "whatever condition he's in, you hold it together until we're out. You fall apart after. Not during." She nodded. Her throat was too tight for words. "He's alive," Garrett said. "We go in with that as the fact. Everything else is details." She nodded again. And they moved into the dark. 40 men and one woman moving across the desert floor with an intention so focused it seemed to displace the air around them. She stayed close to Rudy, matching his pace, watching where he placed his feet, and placing hers in the same prints. The bunker entrance was nothing like what she'd pictured. She'd imagined something that announced itself. A heavy door signage, something that said, "This is the place." What Garrett's advance team had found was a maintenance access point disguised as a utility shed. The kind of structure that sits in a landscape and becomes invisible, not because it's hidden, but because it looks exactly like what it's pretending to be. A box. Weathered. Unremarkable. The kind of thing your eyes slide off because there's nothing there to catch them. The first entry team went in 4 minutes ahead of the main group. She stood in the desert dark with Rudy and waited. Those 4 minutes were the longest she had experienced in a life that had contained in the last 6 months a considerable number of long minutes. She counted her heartbeats, not because the count meant anything, but because her mind needed a task, something specific and small to focus on, so it didn't run too far ahead of her body into all the possible things waiting at the end of whatever came next. She got to 63 before the radio on Rudy's belt clicked twice. He looked at her. "That's our signal," he said. She breathed in. She followed him into the dark. The bunker was larger than any exterior suggested. She felt the space before she could properly see it. The change in acoustics, the way sound moved differently when the walls were far enough apart and made of the right material concrete. Thick old, the kind that had been poured with a specific purpose in mind, and had been fulfilling that purpose for longer than anyone currently inside it had been alive. The ceiling was lower than she expected. The air had a quality to it that she had no reference for, flat and stale and heavy, with something that sat underneath the smell of machinery and dust, something older that she made a deliberate decision not to try to name. Rudy moved ahead of her. She followed. The entry team had already cleared the first corridor. She could see the evidence of that as they moved through it, a door standing open that had presumably been closed, a light fixture on the ceiling that flickered in a damaged way, a radio handset on the floor that someone had dropped or thrown. She looked at these things as she passed them and noted them and kept moving because stopping to process any individual piece of this was not something she could afford right now. Men moved in every direction with the coordinated efficiency of a group that had compressed individual decision-making into something closer to instinct. Voices calling positions in the shorthand of people who had done this before. The controlled noise of a building being taken apart room by people who knew exactly what they were doing and were doing it quickly. She stayed with Rudy. She kept moving. The first resistance came at the inner corridor junction. Two of Calloway's contractors who had been awake, in position, not sleeping, not caught completely off guard, but caught in the gap between readiness and what 40 Iron Cross MC riders moving with serious intent actually looked like in practice. The gap proved decisive. The confrontation was brief and loud, and then it was over and she didn't have time to process it because Rudy was already moving again, and her job was to keep up. The radio erupted, multiple voices overlapping, positions being called, corridors being cleared, status updates in the clipped shorthand of people transmitting exactly as much information as needed and nothing more. Then Garrett's voice cutting through the others. Calloway is in the eastern wing. He's got 4 men and he's moving toward the substructure access. A pause. Razor is with him. Rudy looked at her. She looked back. Substructure, she said. That's where Carson is. I know, Rudy said. Then we go there. Come on. They moved fast. The corridor they went down was long and straight and lit by fluorescent tubes mounted at intervals, half of which had given up at some point in the past and never been replaced. The light came in sections, bright, then dim, then bright again, and the rhythm of it, as she moved through it, had a quality she couldn't name, something that made the distance feel both longer and shorter than it was. She counted her steps, not because the count would tell her anything useful, because her mind still needed the small specific task to keep it from running too far ahead into the room at the end of this. She got to 41 before the corridor opened. The space was larger than the corridor that had led to it. Higher ceiling, multiple points of entry from different directions. And in the center of it, 2 men facing each other across a distance of 15 feet, with the stillness of a confrontation that has arrived at the moment where everything preceding it has been said, and what remains doesn't require words. Garrett stood with his back partially to her, his posture carrying the compressed tension of a man holding himself very still because the alternative is moving too fast. His hands were at his sides. His voice when he spoke had a quality she hadn't heard from him yet, lower than low, stripped of everything except precision and the weight of a man who has been carrying something for 2 months and has just arrived at the place where he can finally set it down. On the other side of the space, Dean Briggs, Razor. She had constructed an image of him in her mind from Carson's voice on the recordings, from the warmth in her brother's tone when he talked about the man who trained him, from the specific quality of trust in his voice that she recognized because it was the same quality she'd heard in his voice when he talked about her. The image she'd built was of someone you could believe. Someone who had earned a particular kind of faith through the patient work of being consistently reliable over a long period of time. The man standing across the space from Garrett matched that image in certain surface ways. Broad through the shoulders, gray at the temples, carrying himself with the ease of someone who had spent decades being competent at things that required competence, and in every other way did not match it at all. Because what she saw on Dean Briggs's face was the face of a man whose image of himself had been constructed on a foundation that was currently collapsing, and who was watching it collapse without quite having the resources to stop it. Behind Razor, partially obscured, stood a man in civilian clothes with the bearing of someone who had spent a career expecting rooms to arrange themselves around his presence. Older, controlled in the way of a man who has built control into such a habit that it functions even under pressure. Frank Calloway. She recognized him from a photograph she had found 6 weeks into her search, a federal directory image designed to communicate authority and nothing else. He had the face of a man who understood the value of being forgettable. He didn't look forgettable now. He looked like a man who has spent 3 years believing he controlled all the variables and is discovering in real time that he missed one. Against the far wall behind Calloway's remaining contractors, she could see it, the substructure access. A heavy door, reinforced, currently standing open. Beyond it, the top of a staircase descending into darkness. "Step away from the access door," Garrett said. Still not loud, still not raised. The voice of a man who has not needed to raise his voice in order to be the most serious thing in a room for a very long time. Razor didn't move. "Maddox," he said, then caught himself. "Old habit. Garrett." His voice had a tremor in it he was fighting. "You're going to listen to me. You're going to listen because I have been with this club for 14 years and you owe me that much." "You sold a member of this club to a federal contractor," Garrett said. "You sat at our table. You ate our food. You slept under our roof while you were doing it." He paused. "You don't have 14 years. You have nothing." It wasn't. Razor stopped. Started again. It was a business decision. The operation was going sideways, and someone had to make the call. Someone had to. His name was Carson Hart, Garrett said. "Say his name." Silence. "Say his name," Garrett said again. The quiet that followed was the quiet of a thing that has moved through anger and come out the other side into territory that is colder and more permanent than anger. The quiet of a decision being made in real time. Razor's jaw tightened. Something moved across his face, not remorse, not exactly, but the shadow of a man who has reached the end of the road he built for himself and is standing at the edge, looking down at what it cost. That was when he looked past Garrett and saw Riley. She hadn't meant to be visible. She had come around the corner with Rudy and stopped, and Rudy had positioned himself partially in front of her, and she had been watching from that partial cover with the focused attention of someone cataloging everything in the room. But Razor's eyes found her, and she watched the calculation happen on his face with the same clarity she watched customers calculate whether they could get away without leaving a tip. The rapid inventory of what remained available, what leverage existed, what the board looked like from where he was standing. He moved before anyone had fully processed the shift in his attention. Left around Garrett's outside, using the fraction of a second of reaction time as the gap he needed. 4 steps. His hand closed around her arm. He pulled her in front of him, and the gun was at her head before the motion had fully registered in the room around her. Everything stopped. The crystallized stillness of a situation that has just moved outside the reach of any normal set of rules. 40 men and Frank Calloway and the remaining contractors, all of them held in the suspension of a moment where the wrong movement in the wrong direction costs something that can't be given back. Garrett had gone absolutely motionless. His eyes were on her face, not on Razor, not on the gun, on her face. And what she saw in his expression was something she had seen glimpses of all night, but not this, clearly the specific cost of allowing something to matter. The particular vulnerability of a man who has decided to care about an outcome and is now watching the outcome be used against him. "Let her go," Garrett said. His voice was completely flat. The flatness of a voice with everything removed from it except the essential content of the words. "I walk out of here," Razor said. His voice was not flat. It was the voice of a man playing his last card with full awareness of how thin it is. "I walk out with her, and I get clear, and then I let her go." "That's the trade." "That's not a trade," Garrett said. "That's a request. Call it whatever you want." "If I let you walk out of here with her," Garrett said, "you don't let her go. You know that. I know that. Everyone in this room knows that. So the negotiation you're proposing doesn't exist." Razor's grip on her arm tightened. She felt the pressure of it, the physical reality of a frightened man holding on to the only thing he had left with the specific force of someone who understands that letting go means it's over. She could feel his breathing against the side of her head, fast and shallow. The breathing of a system running entirely on adrenaline and decisions that have run out of road. She was afraid. She was genuinely and completely afraid in a way that was physical and specific and real. Not the managed functional fear she had been operating inside all evening, but the clean animal fear of a body that has registered a gun at its head and is responding with every system at once. Underneath the fear, something else was happening. She was thinking. She was thinking about the recordings, about Carson's voice in the seventh one, the one she had listened to more times than any of the others, the one where his voice had the quality of a man who had arrived at a specific understanding and was documenting it because he thought it might be useful to someone someday if they were paying the right kind of attention. He had talked about Razor in that recording, about the meeting where everything had gone wrong, and he had said she could hear it as precisely as if the recorder were playing in her hands right now. His voice with the slight roughness it got when he was tired and talking to himself in an empty room. He had said the thing about Razor is he always telegraphs with his left hand. You want to know what he's actually doing? Don't watch the hand he's showing you. Watch the one he isn't. She looked at Razor's right hand, the one holding the gun. She looked at his left hand, the one gripping her arm. His left hand was not pulling her toward the exit. It was pulling her in small increments backward and to the right, toward the substructure access, toward the open door and the staircase descending into darkness. He wasn't trying to get out of the building. He was trying to get into the room below it. There's something in the substructure, Riley said. Her voice came out steadier than seemed reasonable given the circumstances. But she had been holding herself steady all night, and her body had apparently decided to continue. He's not trying to escape, she said. He needs something in those rooms. Razor's grip on her arm spasmed. Files, she said. Evidence. Something he's been keeping here that he can't walk away from because it ties him to Calloway as thoroughly as it ties Calloway to him. She looked at Garrett. He's not holding me hostage to walk out. He's holding me hostage to buy time to destroy something. The fraction of a second that followed was the smallest unit of time she had ever been fully conscious of. Razor's gun hand moved, not much, not far, but in the direction of the thought she'd just spoken aloud, rather than in the direction of any threat in the room. The involuntary movement of a body responding to something the mind is processing the half-second when attention splits and the grip on a single thing loosens because it's trying to hold too many things at once. She dropped. Straight down. Not sideways, not forward, straight down. Knees hitting the concrete floor with a pain that was sharp and immediate and completely irrelevant. Her body folding completely out of the space where she had been standing, out of the arm that had been holding her into the gap that the fraction of a second had opened. She heard the gun discharge above her, into the ceiling. Plaster dust came down. She heard Garrett move, felt the displacement of air, the pressure change of a large man crossing a room at speed. She pressed herself flat to the floor with her hands over her head, and she stayed there. She breathed. She listened to the room above her resolve itself fast loud, and then suddenly not loud, the cessation of noise that is more jarring than the noise itself. When it was over, Rudy's hand was on her shoulder. Up, he said. You're okay. Up. She got up. Razor was on the floor. Garrett stood over him. The gun was gone. Razor was conscious, but held down by two men who were using considerably more force than the situation strictly required, and she understood that the excess was not inefficiency, it was a message being delivered in the only language currently available. Frank Calloway had his back against the far wall. His composure, which had been remarkable throughout everything she had witnessed tonight, was finally showing its limits. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, in the way his eyes were moving around the room, calculating, reassessing, arriving repeatedly at the same answer, which was that he had no moves left that he hadn't already played. She walked toward Garrett. She stopped beside him and looked down at Razor. At Dean Briggs, who had eaten dinner beside her brother and called him family, and taught him the things he needed to know to survive in a world that Carson had chosen to enter, and who had then made a phone call that put him in a concrete room under the Nevada desert floor. Razor looked up at her. She didn't say anything. There was nothing she needed to say. Everything she felt was probably visible on her face, and she wasn't trying to manage it. The anger and the grief and the specific exhaustion of 6 months spent looking in a direction she hadn't known was the right one. She let him see all of it. She let him see it without flinching and without performing any version of it that was more or less than exactly what it was. What she saw on his face in return was the thing she had been half expecting and half dreading the absence. The missing piece. The space where recognition of the human cost should have been and wasn't. Not cruelty, not satisfaction. Just a man looking at the consequence of a decision he had made as if the consequence in the decision existed in separate rooms with no door between them. She looked at Garrett. The room, she said. Carson. Go, Garrett said. She went. Through the substructure door and down the stairs. 14 steps. She counted them the way she'd been counting things all night, her mind using small, specific numbers to stay tethered to the present moment, rather than running too far ahead into the room at the end of this corridor. The air changed as she descended heavier, older, the air of a space that had not been exchanged with the outside world in a long time. The smell of concrete and something beneath it that she recognized now that she had names for now, after everything the night had given her names for. Rudy was behind her with a flashlight. The beam moved ahead of them down the corridor, 3 doors on the left. She stopped at the third one. Her hand went to the door handle, and she couldn't move. She stood there with her hand on the handle of the third door on the left, 14 steps below the surface of the Nevada desert at 2:47 in the morning, and she could not make herself turn it. 6 months of forward motion, every report filed, every call made, every shift worked with grief pressed flat beneath her sternum. Every night she had lain awake running Carson's face through her mind to make sure she still had it exactly right. Every morning she had gotten up and put on her apron and smiled wide enough to mean it at people who had no idea what she was carrying. All of it had been moving toward this door. And now she was here, and she could not make herself open it. Because on the other side was either the thing she had been holding on to for 6 months, or the thing she had been afraid to confirm. And her body, which had been steady all night with a steadiness she had not fully known she was capable of, had chosen this particular moment to remind her that it was made of something softer than the performance she'd been giving. The fear was different from every other fear she had felt tonight. Not the fear of the gun or the contractors or the dark building. It was the oldest fear. The one that had been living in her chest since the first morning she'd woken up and reached for her phone and found no messages from Carson and understood in the way you understand certain things before you have any evidence for them that something was wrong. The fear that she was wrong about him being alive. The fear that she had built 6 months of everything on something that wasn't true. Rudy stopped behind her. He didn't speak. He didn't tell her it was going to be okay, or that she needed to keep moving, or any of the things people say when they are trying to help and don't know how. He simply stood behind her in the corridor and was present, and after a moment she felt his hand settle on her shoulder. Not a grip, not a guide, just a hand placed there with the quiet deliberateness of a man who understood that sometimes the only useful thing you can offer someone is the evidence that you are still beside them. She breathed in. She turned the handle. The door opened. The room was small and dark and smelled like a place that had been holding something for too long. Rudy moved the flashlight beam across the floor up the wall across the far corner. The cot. The shape on the cot. The shape that was a person. That was thinner than 6 months ago noticeably, in a way that registered even in the first second of the flashlight beam, with a face she had been carrying in her memory for half a year, running it through her mind every night to make sure she still had it exactly right. The face turned toward the light. His eyes found her. He said in a voice that was barely a voice, cracked and raw with disuse, the voice of someone who had been in a room with no one to speak to for long enough, that speech had become an effort. The body wasn't sure it could still manage. He said her name. Riley, just her name, just that one word. And everything she had been holding together for 6 months, every shift, every cold cup of coffee, Every report filed into silence. Every morning, she had gotten up and decided again not to stop. Every night, she had held herself at arm's length from the full weight of what it meant that he was gone. Every single piece of it came apart at once. She crossed the room in 3 steps. 3. She sat down on the edge of the cot, and she put her arms around her brother, and she held on with both hands, and she did not let go. He felt thinner than she expected, and his arms, when they came up around her, were slower than she remembered the arms of someone whose body was doing serious repair work and had rationed its resources accordingly. But they came up, and they held on. And she felt him exhale against her shoulder, a long, slow, complete exhalation. The breath of a man who has been holding himself together through sheer will for weeks and has just been given permission to stop. Behind her, she heard Rudy step back into the corridor. The door moved to almost closed. The small and human gesture of a man who carried a death's head patch and had done violence tonight and was also, it turned out, paying attention to what mattered. Some courtesies don't need explaining. "I knew you'd come," Carson said into her shoulder. His voice was wrecked, but certain. "I knew you'd figure it out. You left me a recorder in a boot," she said. Her voice was not steady. She was not trying to make it steady. "That's your idea of a clue." A sound from him, not quite a laugh, not quite a cough. Something in the territory of both. "Did it work? I'm here, aren't I?" she said. She felt him exhale again. Longer this time. The full release of something that had been held at maximum tension for a very long time. "Yeah," he said, "you're here." They stayed like that for a while. She didn't count the minutes. She didn't need to. The counting was over. The forward motion and the grief in the 6 months of strategic movement toward this moment, all of it had arrived here in a small concrete room, under the desert in the dark, with her brother's arms around her and nothing left to hold together. She let it go. Above them, the bunker was being systematically dismantled by 40 men who knew exactly what they were looking for. Servers, files, records of everything Calloway had run through this facility for 3 years, the evidence he had buried specifically because it was too comprehensive to exist anywhere with a conventional chain of custody. The documentation of a man who had been so certain of his own control that he had kept meticulous records of his crimes because the records were useful and he had never seriously entertained the possibility that anyone would ever see them. He had forgotten about Carson. He had underestimated Riley. Frank Calloway, when they brought him out of the building into the cold Nevada air, said nothing. He was a man who had built a career on knowing precisely when a situation could be managed and when it couldn't. And he was applying that knowledge now to the only asset he had remaining, which was silence, and whatever deal might be constructed between this moment and whatever came after it. Razor was less composed. She heard him distantly, still talking, still working the room even from the floor, still searching for the angle that would open something up, because that was who he was, and apparently who he continued to be even at the end of every road. She didn't go back to see him. She stayed with Carson until Rudy came back to the door and said quietly that they needed to move. She helped her brother to his feet. He stood with the careful deliberateness of someone taking inventory of what his body could still do and finding the results provisional. She put her arm through his. He let her. They went up the 14 stairs. At the top, Garrett was waiting. He looked at Carson. Carson looked at him. Something moved between them in that exchange dense with history. She had only partially been told the recognition of two men who had trusted each other in circumstances where trust was a genuine gamble and were now standing on the far side of what that gamble had cost. "You look terrible," Garrett said. "You're late," Carson said. His voice was barely there, but the dry humor of it was intact, completely characteristically intact. She felt something loosen in her chest at the sound of it, that tone she had heard in her memory for 6 months and had been afraid she was misremembering. Garrett looked at him for a moment. Then he put his hand on the back of Carson's neck, not a grab, a grip. The gesture of a man placing his hand on someone he considers his own. "Welcome back, brother," he said, very quietly, just for Carson. Carson closed his eyes for 1 second. Just one. Then he opened them and looked past Garrett at the pre-dawn sky beginning to show itself above the Nevada desert. The particular blue that arrives before color does the sky's announcement that morning is coming, whether or not the night is finished with its business. She watched his face do the thing that she looked away from after a moment because some things belong only to the person feeling them. The expression of a man seeing the outside world after a long time in a room with no windows. Something raw and private. She took his hand instead. He squeezed back. Hard. The drive back to Black Ridge took 2 hours. Carson slept for most of it with his head against her shoulder, his breathing slow and uneven in the way of a body doing serious repair work that has commandeered all available resources for that purpose. She didn't move. She sat completely still and let him sleep and watched the desert lighten outside the window as the sun began its climb. The sky moving from pre-dawn blue to gray to the pale gold of an Arizona morning that always looked to her like proof that beauty could exist in hard places. Rudy sat across from them. He looked out the other window and gave them the silence. And she thought again of the gesture in the corridor, stepping back, closing the door partway. The small and specific decency of a man who understood that some moments required privacy and who had chosen to provide it without being asked. When the van pulled into the diner's gravel lot and the engine cut out, she felt something change in her chest. Not fully, not completely, too much had happened, and too much remained for anything to resolve itself all at once. But something. The shift of a knot that has been pulled tight for long enough that you've forgotten it was there until someone finds the right end and eases it just slightly toward release. Carson stirred when the engine stopped. He lifted his head and looked around with the slow, recalibrating expression of someone returning from a distance. Then he looked at her, and she watched his face do the thing it had been doing since she found him in that room, confirming over and over in small, involuntary moments that she was real, that this was real, that the thing he'd been holding on to in the dark had turned out to be true. "We're home," she said. He looked out the window at the diner. At the plywood over the front window, already installed by someone who had decided that practical things needed doing and had done them without waiting to be asked. At the Route 66 sign still standing in the early light. At the gravel lot he had walked across more times than he could count. "It's the ugliest building I've ever seen," he said. "I know," she said. "I missed it so much," he said. His voice broke on the last word. Just slightly. He turned toward the window. She looked at her hands. Some courtesies don't need explaining. Heck was inside. She could hear him before she saw him. The sound of a broom on tile, the rhythm of Heck Dolan cleaning something he'd already cleaned, doing it again because his hands needed the motion, and the motion gave his mind somewhere to be that wasn't the place where everything he couldn't fix lived. She pushed the door open. He turned. His face did something complicated and complete when he saw her, the movement of a man whose relief and anger and worry have been coexisting at maximum capacity for the last several hours and are now receiving the information that allows them to begin resolving. And then he looked past her at Carson and the broom handle hit the floor. He crossed the diner in 4 steps. He grabbed Carson by both arms and held on. "You look like something the desert coughed up," Heck said. His voice was rough in the way of a voice being held together by effort alone. "Good morning to you too," Carson said. "I oughta." Heck stopped. Started again. His jaw was working. 6 months, he said. 6 months, you. "Heck," Carson said quietly. "I know," Heck said. "I know." And he pulled Carson in and held him the way people hold on to someone they've been afraid of losing. Not gracefully, not with any particular form, just with both arms in full sincerity and no self-consciousness about it whatsoever. She stood and watched and felt the bittersweet weight of witnessing someone else's relief, which is its own emotion, separate from your own relief, but connected to it the way tributaries connect to the same river. The Iron Cross men filtered into the diner around them. Some sat. Some stood along the walls. She poured coffee without being asked because her hands needed something to do, and the motion of it, the familiar weight of the pot, the sound of coffee hitting ceramic was more grounding than anything else available to her. She set a mug in front of Garrett. He looked at it, then at her. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "I want to." She sat down across from him. The booth didn't wobble. It had never wobbled. She had always given this one to people who needed steadiness. "What happens now?" she said. He wrapped both hands around the mug. "The files from the bunker servers get processed through channels that have nothing to do with Callaway's network. People I trust who know how to move information in ways that don't leave traces back to us." He paused. "It'll take a week, maybe two, before it starts surfacing. When it does, it won't come from us officially. It'll look like a leak from inside Callaway's own operation. And Callaway himself." Garrett looked at his coffee. "He's in federal custody by this morning. We made an anonymous call with enough specific detail that the people who've been watching him for years and never had quite enough to move on couldn't ignore it." He paused. "They have enough now. The evidence on those servers would be enough for anyone. Will it hold?" "Callaway kept meticulous records," Garrett said. "The arrogance of a man who was certain he controlled all the variables." He looked up. "He forgot about Carson. He underestimated what your brother had already built against him before he disappeared." She absorbed that. "He forgot about me," she said quietly. "No," Garrett said. "He never knew about you. That was his mistake." She looked at the counter, at the laminate surface with its long, pale streaks. From years of cleaning the scratches, she knew the origin of the slight tilt to the left that nobody had ever bothered to correct, because it had always been there. And by the time anyone thought to fix it, it had become part of what the diner was. "I need you to say something to Carson," she said, "when he's ready to hear it. I need him to know that you know what he did, what it cost him, and why he did it. I need him to hear that from you." Garrett looked at her for a moment. "I will," he said. She believed him. That was the thing. She believed him completely and without qualification, and she understood that the belief was not naive. It was the product of a specific and extensive evening of evidence. The understanding that reliability is not distributed according to who carries a badge and who doesn't. That the most dangerous assumption you can make about a person is that the category they belong to tells you everything you need to know about them. "What about Razor?" she said. Garrett was quiet for a long moment. "Club business," he said, "which I won't describe. But I'll tell you this, the thing that will be hardest for him is not the consequence. It's the understanding. Whether he has the capacity to sit with what he actually did, to look at it as a human thing rather than a tactical one." He paused. "Some men don't." She thought about Razor's face when he'd looked up at her from the floor. The absence she'd seen there. The space where recognition should have been. "No," she said. "I don't think he does." Garrett nodded slowly. "Then that's his punishment. Not understanding. Going through the rest of his life with only the money and the consequence, and none of the understanding of what either of them cost." He picked up his coffee. "That's worse than anything else I could give him." She wasn't sure she agreed, but she appreciated the frame. She watched a little while later as Garrett crossed the room toward Carson's booth. He didn't ask permission. He didn't announce himself. He just sat down across from her brother the way a man sits down across from someone he owes a specific and particular thing to, deliberately without ceremony, because the moment was too important for ceremony. She was too far away to hear what he said. She didn't try to get closer. Whatever it was between them. Carson listened with his eyes on the table at first, then slowly raised his head. His jaw worked once. Then he nodded a single slow nod, the nod of someone receiving something they needed and didn't know how to ask for. Garrett put his hand briefly on Carson's shoulder and stood and walked away. Neither of them looked at her. She was grateful for that. Carson came and sat beside her about an hour later, moving with the careful deliberateness of a body taking stock. Heck had fed him, had produced food with the focused urgency of a man expressing everything he couldn't say through the only language he fully trusted, and the food had put some color back in his face. Not all of it, but some. He looked around the diner, at the men filling the booths, at Heck behind the counter pretending to organize things that were already organized, staying close because proximity was the only confirmation he currently trusted. You actually walked up to them, Carson said. Not to anyone specific, just to the air. You walked into this room and you walked straight up to them. I heard the engines, Riley said. I recognized the opportunity. He turned and looked at her. His eyes were the same as they'd always been, that shade of brown that was warmer than it looked in photographs, direct in a way that had always made it difficult to be anything less than honest with him. You could have been killed, he said. Yes, she said. You went into something you knew was dangerous with a recorder in your boot, she said, because you decided someone had to be the friction. She held his eyes. So don't look at me like that. He stared at her for a long moment. Then he laughed. A real laugh, rough and short and completely genuine. The laugh of someone who has just run out of the ability to argue because the argument has been definitively won. When did you get like this, he said. I've always been like this, she said. You were just never in enough trouble before for it to come out. He put his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into it. They sat like that while the diner did what it had always done. Coffee brewing, ceiling fan clicking on every third rotation, the sound of men talking in low voices, the distant sound of the highway through the walls. The ordinary persistence of a place that had been here before this night and would be here after it. She let herself feel the completeness of it. Not the tidiness. None of this was tidy. There was too much that would need to happen in the weeks ahead. Carson's recovery, the testimony, the aftermath that was already building on the horizon. Too many loose ends and hard conversations, and days that were going to be difficult in ways she couldn't fully anticipate yet. But completeness was different from tidiness. Completeness was about whether the essential thing was in place, whether the center held. The center held. 2 days later, the first report surfaced. Heck had the radio on in the kitchen. He came out with his apron still on to tell her what he was hearing: a federal official under investigation, a black site operation in the Nevada canyons, allegations of evidence tampering and financial crimes spanning 3 years. The reports were careful. They named Callaway, but not the sources. They used phrases like confidential information, an ongoing federal investigation, and credible new evidence. They told exactly as much of the story as they had been given to tell, which was not the whole story. The whole story would never make the news. The whole story involved a 23-year-old waitress who had walked into a room full of the most feared men in the American Southwest and poured them coffee and told them the truth. It involved 40 men who had held a diner and then ridden through the dark toward a building that didn't appear on any map. It involved a brother who had put a recorder in a boot and trusted that someone who loved him would be stubborn enough to find it and smart enough to know what to do with it. None of that was in the reports. She didn't mind. A week later, she was working the morning shift. New glass in the front window. Vinyl stools repaired. The booth in the back corner re-leveled so it no longer drifted. She was refilling the coffee for a couple she'd never seen before, travelers passing through, the way Route 66 delivered people to you without warning or context or backstory when she heard it. The sound of motorcycle engines in the distance. She set down the coffee pot. She knew the sound now in the way you know the voice of someone specific. Not just the category of sound, but the character of it, the depth and the rhythm of it, the way it occupied the air differently than anything else. 2 bikes, just 2. She walked to the window. They came down the main street of Black Ridge slowly, with the unhurried ease of people who have somewhere to be and are not in a rush to get there. Not stopping, not accelerating, just moving through. The lead rider turned his head toward the diner as he passed. Garrett. He didn't stop. He didn't wave. He didn't make any gesture that would require the world around them to see and interpret and incorporate into the story it was telling itself. He had simply turned his head the way a person turns their head towards something they recognize, and looked at her through the window. And nodded. One small, deliberate, completely unambiguous nod. Not at a waitress, not at a witness, not at a young woman who had stumbled into something above her head and needed to be managed. At a person he respected. At someone who had earned the specific and uncomplicated regard of a man who did not give it easily or often, or without full understanding of what he was giving it to. She nodded back. He rode on. Behind her, the diner continued its morning. The coffee brewing the griddle, heating the sound of Heck in the kitchen, beginning the familiar rhythm of his day. Carson was in his booth in the back corner, sitting upright, both hands around his mug, moving with the careful economy of a man who was still taking inventory, but taking it with the patience of someone who trusted the inventory to eventually come out in his favor. He hadn't said anything during the pass-by, hadn't moved, just sat and watched the window with the expression she was learning to read, the expression of a man who went into the dark expecting not to come out, and came out anyway, and is still every day deciding what to do with that. "You okay?" she said. He looked at her. "I'm working on it," he said. "Good enough," she said. She picked up the coffee pot. She moved down the counter. She smiled at a man in a trucker hat who had driven through the night and needed coffee and a friendly face. And the smile was wide enough to mean it because she meant it. Because this was her diner, and her brother was in his booth, and the ceiling fan was still clicking on every third rotation, and the desert outside was going gold in the morning light. And she had learned something in the last week that she would spend a long time understanding in new ways every time the world presented her with another version of the question. The most dangerous people were not always the ones who looked dangerous. The most trustworthy people were not always the ones the world had certified as safe. And fear, real fear, the kind that lives in the bones, was not a reason to stop. It was just the cost of doing the thing that mattered. She topped off the trucker's coffee. She wrote down his order. She called it back to Heck through the pickup window, and Heck called back that it was coming right up. And the morning continued the way mornings do, steadily without drama. One moment following another, the way they always had and always would, regardless of everything that had happened in the dark. She got back to work.